Right, let's start. Hello, good evening, thanks all for coming. I'm Misha Glenny, and the reason why I'm here is probably because the last book I wrote was called DarkMarket, How Hackers Became the New Mafia, which is really a consideration of what's been going on not just in the area of crime, but also in the areas of espionage and possibly warfare on the internet and parts of the internet that most of us don't usually explore. And it's taken me off in a bit of a different direction from where I was before, but it convinced me that all of us who are involved in understanding the way the world works, we all really have to engage now with network computer technology. We have to engage with innovation in digital areas because not only are human beings increasingly deeply dependent on network computer technology and will become and do indeed become very distressed when network computer technology ceases to function. But in the past 10 years, states in particular have woken up to the idea that the internet, the great democratizing technology, is far too powerful and important to be left in the hands of ordinary people. And nowhere is this being better demonstrated to some degree than in the Russian Federation at the moment. And we have got, and this is not to belittle Ed Lucas over on the other side from the international editor of The Economist, who does sterling work on Russia and other areas, but we have with us two of really the finest journalists that Russia has produced since the end of communism in terms of the work that they've been doing since the end of communism, which is focusing on the secret state, on the surveillance state, and the way that the FSB functions, the way it interacts with business and with the media and so on. But recently, they have been coming up with the most fantastic material on how Russian companies and the Russian state are encouraging the development of technologies which really are, I know this is a word that is thrown out a lot, but they are potentially truly Orwellian in their implications. If we take 1984 as an example, it is unbelievable what Russian technologists are now developing, although you're about to hear some of them, in terms of surveillance, digital surveillance capacity. But of course, what's also interesting as far as we're concerned is the fact that this isn't happening in isolation. It links up with things that are happening in states around the world, including in the European Union and in North America, and the implications of this are truly frightening. And that's, for the moment, about as much as I'm going to say, because I want to hand over, first of all, to Andrei and Irina to discuss with us, first of all, the way that the surveillance state has been developing over the past 5 to 10 years, and then specifically to explain to us what these technologies are, how they're being developed, and who is developing, and what their relationship with the state and law enforcement and intelligence agencies are. And it's quite a gripping story. So I'll turn straight away to Andrei on my left, and the two of them work as a sort of double act journalistically, but also either of you come in when you've got anything to say. I'll leave it to the two of you to work out who says what.
Great, and thank you very much, Misha, for this great presentation. And first, what I would like to say that what is quite clear that over the last 2-3 years, the Kremlin put a lot of effort to turn Russia into a surveillance state. And different Russian secret services launched several programs to monitor and control what goes on the internet and what's come off it. And we are talking not only about the FSB or the Interior Ministry, but even the Foreign Intelligence Service recently launched a program to develop a software to monitor what's going on social networks and even influence public opinion on the internet. But the problem is that it's not only about the internet. The Russian Interior Ministry has an ambitious program to acquire unmanned drones. And Vladimir Putin in person last year announced that the Russian state is determined to spend 400 billion rubles, so it's something about $12 billion on unmanned drones. We also have the situation when such technology as voice recognition, face recognition are very well developed, and the Russian state are very interested in them. And but the problem, also I need to say, but I quite forgot, that the number of phone and emails intercepts doubled in 6 years. According to the data that we were able to obtain from the Russian Supreme Court, back in 2007, we had something about 263,000 intercepts, and in 2012, we got 539,000. So it's the number is doubled. But the problem is, and we thought firstly that it was all caused by the Moscow protests and by the decision of Vladimir Putin to get back to the Kremlin and all these manifestations that we got in 2011, 2012. But in fact, it would be too simple to say that it's all provoked by the protest. In fact, this protest started long before Vladimir Putin announced his decision. Already in 2009, Dmitry Medvedev, who was hailed as a liberal alternative to Vladimir Putin, who was then Russian president, he created a special commission on modernization of and technological advancement and development of Russian economy. And this commission created a list of the most important projects crucial for the modernization of Russian economy. And this list consisted of 38 points, and 2 points were proposed by the FSB. And 1 point is about voice recognition system combined with voice biometric. And the second point is about video surveillance with the ability and function to recognize targets, recognize dangerous situation, and to create a large database. And so the problem is that many of these programs, even the programs to control social networks, started before the actual political crisis in Russia.
Irina, so can you give us some examples of how these technologies are being developed, whether it's private sector, whether it's public sector?
Of course, these technologies are mostly developed in private sector, but a few years ago, state started to pay money for this, and a lot of programs were ordered by state. They are paid for developing new technologies, and they're now paid for producing this.
And also we have a strange connection. For example, one of the most important company which engaged in developing such technology, specifically voice recognition and face recognition.
Yes, tell us about the voice recognition, which was something that you uncovered, or at least the agency uncovered more or less single-handed.
It's a problem that sometimes we think that the best and most advanced surveillance technologies are developed in the West. And in many cases that's true. But in some areas, and specifically in the area of voice recognition, Russia is the world leader, and it's quite undisputed. We have a company called Speech Technology Center, or in English it's known as Speech Pro company, which have offices in Russia and in New York, which actually is a direct descendant of the Sharashka, or just a secret facility which worked under auspices of the Stalinist secret police back in the 40s. This secret facility, then it was a part of the Gulag system, they were tasked to identify voices calling in foreign embassy located in Moscow. And this facility was rebranded and relocated to St. Petersburg. Now it's a center of speech technologies. But the problem is that we actually do the same thing.
It's a private company now, is
Now
it?
it's but that's the tricky thing about private companies in Russia. For many years, quite until the mid 2000s, it was a private companies, but working on with contracts, with state contracts, and they, as a chief technological expert of this company, told me openly that they happy to work with the FSB for most of the 90s and 2000s. But quite recently, this company was bought by Gazprom Bank, which is quite close to the state, and given a very good position in the Skolkovo. And you know that Skolkovo was, until very recent time, was a very cherished project supported personally by Medvedev. The problem with this company is, and the main point about it, that the technology that they produce are so good that some countries, for example Mexico, bought this technology and installed the system of voice recognition on nationwide basis. Now the system of, we have the system of voice recognition in two countries, in Ecuador and Mexico, based on Russian technologies. The most tricky thing about it, that when you sell some stuff like technologies and surveillance technologies, you sell not only technologies, you sell procedures. Because actually when law enforcement bought this kind of thing, they ask, the next thing they ask what to do with data that we collect because of these technologies. And this center was happy to provide expertise, how to build new law enforcement units and departments to deal with the data collected because of these technologies, how to disseminate this data, how to use it in court, how to use it this data in criminal investigation. That's why when you buy such things, you buy also Russian procedures to deal with surveillance.
Just out of interest, does SpeechPro have any access to the data that is collected in Mexico at all, either digitally or through the fact that it's training people up in Mexico?
As far as I know, a lot of experts of this company are invited to train people and to have access to, naturally they have access to the data.
Yeah, right. Ed, I want to come to you to give us a sort of brief overview of where you think this is heading. You just revealed to us downstairs that you're writing a book on cyber, and then we had a discussion about what an imprecise term cyber is. But some of the stuff you're doing must be related to what Andrei and Irina are talking about.
Well, thanks very much, Misha. I'm going to be very brief because I really just want to hear more and more and more about what Andrei and Irina are saying. But I think that the way to think about this is that since 1991, the Kremlin has been very good at taking things that we think are good and then using them for their purposes. One of them was capitalism. And Putin is a kind of arch-capitalist who's created a kind of phony capitalist system in Russia which enriches him and his cronies to the tune of tens of billions of dollars a year, and also sprays the West with money and launders colossal amounts in the City of London and elsewhere, and buys power and influence with it. And we've also got a sort of phony multi-party politics with the sort of seemingly outward signs of political parties, courts, and parliaments and institutions and things like that. But actually, it's all a sham, and the Kremlin pulls the strings. And I think a sort of third front on this is the internet. That many people in the West had this sort of, I think, rather deluded idea that the internet was going to be a great democratizer, and it would put processing power in the hands of the people and make it impossible for the authorities to exert control. And in fact, I agree with Yevgeny Morozov here that it is, I think, the other way around, that as soon as you become conspicuous, the processing power that you have as an individual is outweighed by the processing power the state has got, and they can survey you from the moment you wake up in the morning till the moment you go to bed at night, and possibly, if they have a brain-computer interface, they can also record what you're dreaming as well. I think one final point I'd make, so I really am very keen to get back to the main discussants, is the way in which boundaries have blurred. And you were talking about this thing that seems like a private company, but actually it's not. It's the inheritor of the Sharashka. And I guess for those of us here who read Solzhenitsyn during the Cold War. All this stuff about voice recognition reminds us of the first circle. But this blurring of boundaries also happens on the internet between what people here might call cybercrime and what you might also call cyber espionage or cyber surveillance. The same tricks that the criminals use to steal your bank account details are the ones that the authorities can use to turn your mobile phone into a bugging and tracking device, even when you think you've got it turned off. So there's a very interesting overlap between the kind of intellectual frontier of the development of new cybercrime techniques and the intellectual frontier of the development of new surveillance techniques. And perhaps on just one slightly positive note, which I'll just throw back to the other panelists, the great weakness of the Soviet Union during the Cold War was not in the espionage, it was in the processing of the information they got. And they were very good at stealing Western secrets, far less good at actually turning them into usable industrial products or processes. And I just wonder whether this is going to be a bit of the same story with the surveillance, that they're going to accumulate enormous amounts of data. They're going to have tremendous algorithms that crunch everything and can link every clip of audio they get from the mobile phone with every clip of video they get from the from the CCTV cameras on the street. But in the end, will it actually help them? And that's my question. I remember someone telling me when I asked about surveillance in the Moscow of the 1990s, and he said, imagine a room full of cardboard boxes, and every cardboard box is full of cassette tapes. And there'll be a cardboard box with the name Lucas written on it. It's full of cassette tapes of all your phone conversations, and probably of everything you ever said in your office. But does anyone ever have the time to listen to it? So that's really my question for you guys. I think I agree with you. They have incredible power to do the surveillance, but do they have the wit, the ability, the kind of the real intelligence to make useful the stuff that they're surveilling?
Well, actually, well, you're quite correct because, but it's not. Sometimes Russian state tend to use more simple approach than we thought we try to do, and that's actually what happened with the DPI technology, which was installed in Russia because of the internet filtering that we got last November. But I think Irina might describe the
Yes,
situation
can you
in more
explain
detail.
that? Because
What
people are not
about?
going to necessarily understand.
So the problem is that we've got a new internet filtering system in Russia. It was installed last November, and now we have a blacklist of banned websites. For introducing this blacklist of banned websites, authorities forced internet providers and telecommunication operators to buy the new technology DPI on nationwide scale.
That means deep packet inspection.
It's very intrusive and dangerous when it's in state's possession, because this technology can peer into people's traffic, and it can read, copy, and modify emails and web pages, and it
Deep
helps.
packet inspection is something that takes place usually at your ISP, at your internet service provider, and essentially it can read all the data as it's being transmitted and translate it into a comprehensible fashion for whoever is monitoring it. It is the most intrusive type of surveillance that is known. It's used by operations like the National Security Agency in the United States, as well as the Russian state. But I think what Irina is saying is that this is now becoming the normal. In Russia is deep packet inspection, which for those libertarians engaged in the internet around the world, deep packet inspection sends shivers down their spine, because it gives the watcher so much information, and it's much more efficient and quicker than tracking down individual emails or individual logs from computers.
And you don't need a warrant or court decision for wiretapping somebody.
And the problem is, it's give you more options to identify people. The biggest difference between the traditional lawful interception and this kind of technology, when you need to start traditional interception, you need to know the name, and you go from the people. So you go from the guy, suspected guy, targeted guy. DPI is completely it's a quite opposite thing. For example, you need to establish who tried to talk about some protest in Moscow. So you put these words in this system, and this system might help you to identify all people who try to discuss these things on the internet. That's why it's very useful for secret services. But the problem, why actually I started to talk about it, that what we feared back in November when the system was implemented, that this DPI technology was also used to deal with global platforms like Twitter, YouTube and Facebook, because actually, for example, Uzbek authorities used this to quietly remove some pages on Facebook. But what we got instead, we got the situation that the Russian authorities for the first 6 months don't hesitate to use very harsh methods. They don't hesitate to close down the whole services like YouTube. And YouTube was blocked in some Russian regions completely. And that forced the global platforms like Google and Twitter and Facebook to be more cooperative and to respond almost immediately to the Russian request. So in this case, return to your question, the problem is that sometimes Russian authorities understand that to use some simple methods might be more effective. That might seem too brutal and might be too harsh, but actually it's so effective, so efficient, so Russian authorities know how to use it.
You mean simply closing down YouTube?
Just to threat just to pose this threat to the global services, and global services understood these things very well.
Now tell me, Andrei, you and Irina and other people have been highlighting these issues in Russia. When you point out some of the techniques that are being introduced in Russia, do the authorities, does the government respond at all to this, and does it explain why it might be introducing these techniques, or does it try to justify it in any way?
The whole system, the system of internet censorship was introduced under pretext of protecting children. And all kinds of arguments were used to justify this decision. And the problem is that, the real discussion in Russia is it's quite difficult to organize, because people tend to people from the government and from the pro-government fractions in State Duma, they tend to always attack people who try to question this policy, accusing them of being supporters of pedophiles or pornographers or something like that. That's why this discussion is not very productive.
Right, and of course that speaks to Ed's point, which is very, very important, is that you have what I call these various areas of cyber malfeasance: cybercrime, cyber espionage, cyber warfare. Some people would include hacktivism as well. And the problem is that the techniques used in cybercrime are very much the techniques that are used in espionage, or to some degree in warfare, where it happens, cyber warfare. And so it's very difficult to, when a government is trying to introduce a system that will reduce cybercrime, it's very difficult to argue or to explain to people that actually it has other implications about what individuals can or can't do on the internet. But you were telling me earlier that whenever the Russian government introduces a new form of monitoring over the internet or control over the internet, that they point to similar techniques or similar laws or similar regulations that have been introduced in other countries, including...
Specifically in Britain.
Specifically Britain. Very interesting.
Internet
What are they
filtering
talking about in terms of Britain?
When we introduced the system of internet censorship, they always refer to the British example to say, well, the British have this blacklist of sites, of banned websites about child pornography. And this justification, this argument appeared all the time when members of State Duma tried to convince people that it's really a good thing.
Which is ironic, given that, yes, well, particularly given the hosting record of some Russian companies and child pornography sites. But that's a slightly different issue. Ed, are you looking to come in there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very interesting question where the biggest vulnerabilities that make you and me vulnerable, whether it's to criminals or to hostile governments or to our own government, which may or may not be hostile, are holes in software like Microsoft Windows and badly designed chips. And so I think it's an interesting question for me whether some of these vulnerabilities and these so-called zero-day exploits that are used both by criminals and by governments, who's responsible for plugging them and who's perhaps knows about them and is not plugging them. And the thing that perhaps most puzzles me about the surveillance state in Russia is the whole apparatus is designed to preserve Russian national security against the Russian people and against foreign governments who are supposedly working in cahoots with the opposition. And yet they're all running Western computers. I've never seen any discussion in Russia of building a Russian chip or running Russian-only software. So all this stuff presumably comes with backdoors and trapdoors and stuff, which must make them feel a bit nervous that if Putin has a BlackBerry, then presumably all his emails are CC'd to the NSA. And so in a way, I wonder whether this isn't, all governments are sort of in this together. And it's the citizens, the Russian people have more in common with the American and British people against the overlap between bad software and intrusive governments, rather than this being a particularly Russian thing.
So, Andrei, do you see that from your perspective? I know you're looking at the technologies in Russia, but do you see similarities with the way that the criminal justice system or the national security state in the United States is developing internet-based technologies or other digital technologies?
Well, as far as I understand, Britain is still too advanced for Russia, and well, we don't have such number of CCTV cameras, and Russian search engine called Yandex is not very well. As far as I know, was never approached by the security services to change the ranking of search results to show bomb when you type bomb and something like that. And I was told that Google started to cooperate with the British government in this way. And well, I don't know about these things in Russia. But responding to your question, we need to remember that sometimes the Russian authorities and specifically Russian secret services, they are very skillful to turn the situation against the Western technologies, because the usual traditional approach of the Russian security services, specifically FAPSI, that it was a kind of analog of the National Security Agency, and now is a part of the FSB. They always tell the Western producers that if you want to sell something in Russia, you need to open your codes. That's happened back in the mid-1990s when FAPSI asked SWIFT to open all codes to the Russian state and caused a big scandal.
This is the banking
system.
Yeah.
But in this situation they failed. But now they approached Microsoft and asked them to provide codes for Skype, and nobody actually knows about the answer of Microsoft, because Microsoft was very keen to cooperate with the Russian state, and they provided a lot of codes from a lot of programs and software developed by Microsoft. And but there's a big question actually: who use whom?
Yes, it's very interesting. If you have a BlackBerry, and you arrive in Moscow, the first thing you see when you turn it on is it says updating your security settings. You don't get the option to say no thanks.
I mean, this is interesting in terms of the development of both cooperation and competition between states in terms of access to data on all sorts of devices, including mobile devices. I don't know if you recall, a couple of years ago there was a dispute because the United Arab Emirates decided to turn off BlackBerry, and that was because of the BlackBerry messaging service. And what was happening was that if you sent a message from one BlackBerry in Dubai to another one in Abu Dhabi, or indeed Dubai, then it would go to a server in Canada, And then from that server in Canada, it would be sent to the second BlackBerry. What that meant is that in Dubai or in Abu Dhabi, they weren't able to monitor what was going on between those two BlackBerries. But not only that, what they were concerned about is that they knew that the FBI and the NSA had access to those servers in Canada, so that the Americans knew what was going on in the United Arab Emirates, but the United Arab Emirates didn't. And that's why they were insisting, what their argument is we want a server inside the UAE so we can monitor it, and we can monitor what the Americans are monitoring on it as well, on the assumption, which is usually correct, that the Americans are monitoring what's going on. It's now very disturbing when it comes to the development of technologies like the ones that Andre was talking about in terms of Mexico and Ecuador, that there is a race going on from companies in China, in Russia, in Western Europe, in the United States, for markets, particularly in the emerging economies and in countries in the Middle East and the Maghreb and so on, competition for surveillance technologies, for technologies which are sold by the West specifically with outrageously intrusive capacities to countries that they know will be where it will be used in a very unpleasant way. This is the case with Syria, it's the case with Egypt and so on and so forth. And I kind of feel that one of the things that Russia is doing with its surveillance techniques is engaging in this competitive race.
Also, there is a problem when you might understand maybe well in the rest of the world, right? That you might control export of Western technologies to these countries with repressive regimes. The problem is how to try to control export of surveillance technologies developed by repressive regimes to the West, or maybe to the other countries with repressive regimes. As one example, we remember very well big scandal about about Olympic Games in China. And all that stuff about Ericsson and Siemens and the surveillance technologies deployed to secure and to monitor everything that was going on during the Olympic Games. Now we have the coming Olympic Games in Sochi. And as far as we know, the main supplier of telecommunications technology, including surveillance technologies, is Chinese company. And to be frank, I just don't know how to control or to understand what's going on when Russia buys Chinese technology to monitor something in the area of Olympic Games.
Well, China being mentioned, Ed, have you come across China in your research in cyber?
Yes, indeed I have, and I feel we could have a whole evening on the threat from China, both real and perceived. But I actually wanted to ask you about one of the things that the individual still has is the access to extremely strong encryption. If you know what you're doing, you don't have to use Skype. You can use heavily encrypted stuff that doesn't necessarily go over an ISP. You can have all these. And this thing. I mean, I don't want to get too technical here. Does everyone here know what Tor is?
Yes,
Yeah.
Tor is a very good thing.
Yeah. So you've got things like Tor.
Yeah, we can use it.
More to the point, does the audience know what Tor is? Okay, you have to explain Tor. It's basically a system whereby when you communicate over the internet, you bounce around from country to country to ISP to server, and it's rather like what people do with money with the British Virgin Islands and Hong Kong and places like that. After a while, investigators give up trying to track where the original computer is coming from. So it's a way of disguising your identity, essentially, on the internet.
And it seems to me that, I mean, so long as you aren't too conspicuous, and if you're trying to organise a demonstration and email 1,000 people, then obviously the authorities will notice you're making it. But at an individual level, an individual doing something with another individual, it still seems to be the advantage is on the individual's side. If you're digitally literate, is that a phrase, digitally literate?
Yeah, that'll do.
Digerati. And you know what you're doing, that it's still very difficult for them, or even impossible for them to.
And if you have somebody with advanced hacking skills, they can still remain anonymous. Their vulnerability tends to be with their with their real life contacts.
Yes.
But if you see what's been happening in the world of cybercrime, and this is then learnt from elsewhere on the net, and it's learnt by hacktivists and people engaged with civic organizations who want to remain anonymous, is what is happening is they are adopting the classic structures of clandestine organizations, of cell-like structures, so that you can bust somebody in the organization, but it won't lead you to other people. And that is happening on the internet, particularly in cybercrime, but it's being adopted by political activists as well.
We are not yet at this stage. Actually, people, what we got now, who actually turn into streets and joint manifestations, they became politically motivated, politically active only yesterday. We actually know nothing about Tor, and Tor issued a report just few months ago. You may see that the number of users in Russia is very small, and that's why. Well, actually, to use these kind of things, you need to have some technically savvy people, and you need these clandestine organizations. And well, Russian opposition has nothing.
Right,
Well,
although the
that would be my claim, the opposite thing. But actually, the opposition is very open.
Yeah.
We discuss most of things on Facebook.
But
So that's interesting. I mean, because what it means is that the Russian state does tolerate a fair amount of this stuff, and it's as Ed said at the very beginning. You cannot process all of this data, petabytes and petabytes of data that are coming in every day to wherever the servers are in Moscow. You cannot process it all unless they're developing digital techniques, which people are certainly in the United States, to analyze data as it comes in and flag things up. I mean, is that sort of thing going on in terms of as far as you know?
Yeah, and also we have some technical problems. Actually, for example,
The socialist computer.
yeah, something to do with that, because when we investigated particularly the programs which are responsible for monitoring social networks, we were told that Russian engineers had some difficulties with building databases, and we need to buy these programs in the West. And as a result, we got the situation when the FSB might use at the same time thousands of different programs, not because we are so inconsistent, we know nothing about what's going on in different in other departments. The problem is that these systems, but only 20 or 30 people might work simultaneously on one system, only one department or maybe one section. That's why we buy a lot of different programs from different producers. They still have some problems to build a large database like NSA built and use.
Okay, before I throw it over to the audience and we start a broader discussion, what is the difference, Andrea and Irina, between what is going on in terms of surveillance technology development in Russia and what is going on in the United States or Western Europe? Are there qualitative differences, quantitative differences, political differences? Are we as vulnerable as you are, or do we have more protection from these technologies, as far as you know?
Well, I think, of course, the Russian state, the Russian security services, we are quite in different situation because, well, most of global services are actually hosted in the West, and we have, for example, Russian social network called Vkontakte, but it happens that most of politically active people use Facebook and not Vkontakte. And Russian forces, Russian secret services, back in 2011, admitted openly that they had nothing to do with Facebook. They just know nothing about how to penetrate and monitor pages and discussions group on Facebook. But the problem is that sometimes they tend to use bureaucratic decisions, and these bureaucratic decisions might be very good. What we fear now is, and actually it's a kind of tradition for the Russian state, is to say something like, okay, Facebook and Twitter, if you want to operate on the Russian soil, you need to be hosted here in Russia. I think it's something similar to what's going on in China.
Yeah.
And that might be very effective.
Well, because the example of Google in China is very, very important. Google basically supped with the devil in terms of what its philosophy was, because Google was always, you do whatever you want on the internet. But when it went into China, it allowed certain restrictions on its usage inside China, and then found that its presence there was being exploited by the Chinese to hack some of its code, and so it withdrew with its tail very much, I feel, between its legs. Of course, you know, at the moment, we're in this peculiar situation where U.S. secret intelligence agencies and law enforcement can access any account on Google, Facebook, or Twitter with a court order within 24 hours. And if that account belongs to a non-U.S. citizen, they don't even need a court order for it. So they have exceptional powers of intrusion. And one has to remember when it comes to Facebook, Twitter, and Google, that the Russians and the Chinese look at the Americans and they say, this is unfair. They can access any of this shit at any time they want to, and we don't have a chance, so we've got to hack them. And so you get into this sort of crazy competition of surveillance between competing states, which I think is a very, very worrying development. But Ed, you wanted to come in before we throw it open.
I'm very keen to have lots of hostile questions from the audience, but I do think, I mean, the sort of superficial comparison, which I sort of half made earlier, I think is quite unfair, in that the point about the way Russia works is you've got these blurred boundaries. Companies in Russia aren't really companies. They sort of operate on a license from the authorities, and you can get whacked very, very easily. The tax police can come in, the fire inspectors can come in, you can be closed down overnight, and you can end up in jail even if you've done nothing wrong. And so there's a kind of lack of constraint. The authorities in Russia have a capability to be joined up in a way that you just don't have in the West, where if you can, if you want to, get a court order, but the American government can't put, a small internet, say you're making antivirus software, a small American company, the government doesn't like you. Well, there's quite a limit to what it can do. And if you're doing a product that maybe helps people get around things that you're trying to do as a government, well, tough. You have to work very hard to get around that. So I would be hesitant about just saying everyone's the same. But I'm quite keen to have some questions.
Right. I just on that, Ed, one shouldn't underestimate the digital capacity of the security state in the United States. One really shouldn't.
The digital capacity is enormous, but the administrative capacity is much less. That's the difference. Right.
Yeah. Although the issue with the AP today is a very disturbing development.
Yeah, and look, but can you imagine in Russia an enormous scandal because the FSB has been hacking the email accounts at Itar-Tas? This would be like a big scandal.
Yeah, actually, I think what
it wouldn't happen.
You're right, because it's a famous example with Kaspersky.
Yeah.
Kaspersky is very active and very good at exposing American efforts to hack Iranians or some other countries. But the problem is that when we got protests in Moscow, and when the websites of liberal media and some opposition leaders were hacked, Kaspersky kept silence.
Yes. Do you think that Kaspersky is fed stuff from the FSB?
Watch out for libel.
Well, he was trained.
We have to watch out for libel.
This is on the record.
You're absolutely right. It's on the record. I forgot it's streaming. Yeah. Sorry, I'll withdraw that question. Although our libel laws are changing slowly. Let's throw it open to the audience. Anyone want to ask a question? Sir.
I'll introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Edward Baumgartner. My question is, how much of this is used for political counterterrorism, and how much of this is commercial? And I don't necessarily mean foreign economic espionage, but domestic economic espionage, say the security department of a large Russian private company or a state company, which may be staffed by former FSB agents, FAPSI, that sort of thing. And so I guess how much of this is an economic enterprise for the domestic security services versus an actual political enterprise?
Do they have an economic investment in this?
Well, as far as I see, we didn't find any big cases to support that might be true. Also, you need to remember one thing that's quite strange, but actually when the FSB, when we got we got number of scandals when the accounts of political activists were hacked. And in all these cases, we found that behind these attacks, behind these DDoS attacks or somewhere, or just hacking attacks, were not people directly from the FSB, but some hacktivists, or maybe some people just hired by youth organizations that might be close to the Kremlin. The problem is that in this case, it's very difficult to claim responsibility, to find who was behind it. And the security services were very skillful to keep this distance. We didn't find even one example that the Russian security services were behind any of attacks. I think the most famous example is about Estonian attacks. Estonian Minister of Defense, firstly, he claimed it was Russian behind this attack. But then they failed to find proof, and he was forced to say, well, we have nothing.
But then Sergei Markov actually admitted, didn't not Sergei Markov actually admit that it was organised by a guy in his office?
Yes.
Yeah.
But again, we didn't find the direct connections with the state.
Yeah.
Some patriotic youth guys, they might be funded by the Kremlin, but, well, you need to establish with connections.
It's very easy to do. Deniability is really, really easy on the internet.
But I do think the collection, and one of the big things where this sort of crime business and the state overlap, is the collection of compromat, of blackmailing material. And that's part of the business currency in Russia. And so if you need to collect compromat, it may not be the FSB doing it directly. It may be you can find someone who has access to quasi-governmental bugging techniques who will get you the information you need for your business.
That's correct. Actually, we got a very interesting trend. That in the 1990s, when someone was caught with illegal phone interception, these people were mostly from private security companies. But in 2000s, when we investigated these cases, in all these cases, there was someone from the Interior Ministry complicit. So it seems that the scam of this business was changed. So in the 1990s, private security companies, so security services of the oligarchs, they tended to buy the special equipment, and they intercepted people by their own. But in the 2000s, the same oligarchs, the same companies understood that it's much easier and much effective to hire some guys inside the FSB or the Interior Ministry to do this work.
So that basically reflects the general pattern of the restoration of state and FSB authority.
The most disturbing example of how the state involved in surveillance for the citizen is the case of Russian journalist Anna Politkovskaya. He was surveilled by the Interior Ministry team.
Yeah. Another question. Who did I saw that guy over there next. Yeah. No. Behind.
Sorry, Sam Green from King's College. My question really is, how much does any of this matter? Right? I sometimes get the feeling that we've been living in a fantasy world for a few years in which we could do all of this wonderful stuff online and nobody could see it, or we thought that nobody could see it. And the reality is that governments have been able to monitor communications for as long as there have been governments in communication. And is this simply reversion to the norm, and we go on living? I mean, the fact that the governments were able to monitor telephones and fax machines and telegraphs and other means of communication didn't stop authoritarian regimes from falling in the past. And why should we think that this is a game changer in Russia today?
But so,
Yes, and indeed the monitoring of the internet didn't stop Egypt from falling either. So to prove your point, Andre, and then I think Ed wanted to come in on this as well.
just give you one example. If we had, for example, tried to consider what's going on with the Russian influence on the former Soviet Union, on the territory of the former Soviet Union, well, you know that for 20 years the Kremlin tried to create some programs or some alliances, and that was not very effective for most of these 2 decades. But last 3-4 years, Russian surveillance technologies, specifically lawful interception technologies, was exported to many of these countries. And the problem with that, well, it might be a good thing, but you might buy this stuff in Britain or maybe in Russia. The problem that you also import procedures, and you import people who actually explain you how to use this technology, and you also import legislation. And now, if you look at legislation, surveillance legislation in most of these countries, especially Central Asia and Belarus, you might find direct replicas of the Russian legislation. And that's quite important, because there's a big difference between lawful interception in Russia and the United States. Russian interception, lawful interception, is much more intrusive. Just one example, you need to get a warrant in Russia and you need to get a warrant in the United States. The problem is that when the FSB obtains a warrant, it's prohibited to show this warrant to the telecommunication operator. To anybody, actually, because it's organized in a different way. In the United States, this box with lawful interception equipment is managed by the personnel of telecommunication operator. In Russia, the box is installed and managed by the FSB personnel. And you have no ability, you have no option to understand.
At the ISP?
Yeah.
So they put it in the ISP. The ISP pays for it, right?
Yes, that's correct. And there is a direct line to the premises of the FSB, and nobody knows who actually is surveilled and monitored. And this kind of technologies and procedures exported to the other countries. That's why I think it matters.
Ed.
I think it also, I mean, clearly it doesn't recreate as kind of this Stalinist terror where one individual is afraid to say to another individual, have you heard the latest joke about Putin? So the authorities don't have the attention span to be able to control everyone like that, even if they wanted to. What it does do is throw a kind of suffocating digital blanket over anyone who wants to be active or conspicuous. And it's really difficult now if you are, if you say you take your mobile phone and you don't use your mobile phone because they're tracking, buy a prepaid phone instead. Well, actually, that's really difficult in Russia already to get a prepaid phone without showing an ID. And if you have it, it's quite suspicious. And you don't use a credit card or use a prepaid credit card, well, that's actually quite suspicious as well. So, whereas in the Soviet Union, you could actually move. I mean, I was in the Soviet Union illegally at one point as a journalist. You could move around. You played a few very sort of basic tricks on the authorities, and you had huge freedom of action. Particularly in the late Soviet Union, you could really get away with an awful lot because they were using old-fashioned electromechanical surveillance techniques. And just as a wily human being, you could do an awful lot. That's much more difficult now. So as soon as you become, maybe you can turn up to a demonstration and go away again, and nothing much will happen. Try and organise one, and the mere fact that you're trying to do anything attracts the attention of the authorities, and then you get this kind of digital human interface where they start looking at you and saying, okay, what's your job? What does your wife do? What do your children do? Where can we apply pressure? And before you know where it are, all this digital surveillance has led you into a whole bunch of real-world problems.
And I mean, the other thing that I would say, coming off of what Ed said, is that you need many, many fewer resources, human resources, in order to go much deeper into people's lives who are under surveillance. And it's also much easier to put under surveillance large number of people in a way that you couldn't before. The scale of internet technology takes us into a different area, and the issue of privacy is a very significant one. We mustn't forget that the reason why we're discussing this is that as human beings we should have a right to privacy. You are recognized next, and then
Glenmore Trenier Harvey. I'd just like to ask a practical thing about surveillance within the Russian Federation. Presumably the FSB are both the lead agency and also the coordinator. And I want to know to what extent the SVR get involved. And also, when FAPSI was closed down in Putin's first reign, I think you mentioned that it's been subsumed within one of the agencies. Does FAPSI, in its second generation, operate within the FSB?
can everyone explain their acronyms?
Well, FAPSI is a federal security service, so it's a direct descendant of the KGB because it's responsible for counterterrorism, counterintelligence, and preserving of the constitutional order. So it's something about political political stuff, and guardians of the regime. The FOPSI used to be the federal agency responsible for government communications and electronic intelligence. It was disbanded in 2003 and split into two parts, and one part was absorbed by the FSO, and FSO is a Federal Protection Service, something like Secret Service in the United States, responsible for protecting Vladimir Putin and some other guys. And but the most important part, responsible for electronic intelligence, was absorbed by the FSB. So now it's a part of the FSB. The problem, that's a very good question about who else except FSB might do interception. And in the 1990s, it was established that the FSB should. Actually, we have 7 subjects, 7 security services which can use interception. But the FSB was put in charge, and the FSB was put under control of this system, technical system, how to intercept things. But what we got now, and it happened in the mid-2000s, that other services started to buy the lawful interception equipment. They understood it because of the database of state contracts. And now, it's quite surprising, we found out that even the prison service started to buy this equipment and install it in telephone station of towns. And that's quite strange to me because I can't explain it. They are in charge of security inside prisons, but not, they cannot monitor everything what's going on around. But they actually installed, and they bought this equipment, they installed and started to use. And now it's, now we face a situation where the FSB has a system of interception. The Interior Ministry, Prison Service, and the service responsible, Anti-Drug Agency, and maybe some other services, Customs Service also. They all have parallel system of interception. And how to control all this stuff, well, nobody knows.
My name's Kevin. I'm a software. I'm Kevin. I'm a software developer, and I found your talk about software backdoor is interesting. So, if you consider open source software where the code is automatically published, do the secret agencies think that's great because hey, there's the code, or do they get frustrated because they think, hey, there's the code for everybody? I'm just curious if you've heard any comment about whether they find more difficulty or less difficulty with open source software for various types of software products that they have. I mean, I don't know if you've... But
it's a very interesting question. I'd never thought of it.
Yes, it's a good question. Actually, the Russian state is not very happy with open source thing. They think it's not very reliable, but I think maybe the explanation is that the Russian state is very, well, you have these things about license. That's an important thing. But if you need to use cryptography, you need to obtain license. And this means that you need to establish the so-called first section in your premises, and it would be a section consisted of 3, 4, and 2 guys from the FSB, and they would be in charge of your security. They can monitor everything. If you need to deal with the state, and for example you want to sell software to the state, this software should have this special license. It should be cleared by the state. And well, with open source, it's not very practical because nobody can obtain this license. So that's why Russian state is in love with Microsoft, even when it's not very practical. For example, for some network solutions, they still think that the best option is to buy Microsoft because they know whom to approach and whom to grant this license.
So in a decentralized open source environment, it's difficult to sort of say...
But not, well, yes, except that there are other, I mean, even if you run a Ubuntu and Mozilla on your computer and you're using fantastic cryptography and everything's via Tor and so on, all that means is they attack you from a different direction. They'll have a keyboard Trojan and something that is showing your screen, or possibly a pinhole camera in the wall behind you. And they can, you can have a highly armoured pipe, but at the end the pipe just goes from one place to another. And I think you're right, it does make things more difficult, and they love Internet Explorer. If anyone here is still using Internet Explorer, please get rid of it at once. It makes life much easier for Vladimir Putin. But it just moves the area of vulnerability from an easy place to a slightly harder place. It doesn't eliminate it.
Yeah, although of course making it more difficult is,
It's always good.
the point is you're lowering risk. You can't eliminate the risk, but you can lower it. So,
Hi, my name's Martin. I want to ask a more general question. There is genuine cybercrime, so people hacking into networks, into servers that they're not supposed to. But then the people who have to prevent that and try and write encryption code, in a way, isn't there a kind of arms race between them and who, in the end, watches the watchmen? How can you control the people who are trying to prevent hackers from, becoming corrupt, turning into hackers themselves, because they have to have the same skill levels in order to prevent the crime?
well, it's a very interesting question. I argue that, it's interesting because I've interviewed quite a lot of hackers in this country and other countries as well, and indeed just 10 days ago I had dinner with one who'd just been released from prison. And they there is absolutely no rehabilitation program in this country for hackers who are in jail. There's no specialist rehabilitation program. There are 21 people in this country who are under 5-year crime prevention orders, under which this one amongst them who I had dinner with, they are not allowed to access a computer except under supervision at a public place like a library. They are only allowed one email account, and if they forget the password of that email account, they're not allowed another email account until that present one runs out. And they are not allowed mobile phones with access to the internet. Now, what that means is two things. First of all, try and live your life these days without access to a computer. It's effectively impossible, particularly for these people who are looking for jobs, bearing in mind that what they're really good at is hacking. And you're preventing them from using a computer at all. They can't get a conventional job, and eventually they become frustrated and they go back illegally
there's a
to
huge
doing what they're
program
doing.
being run by GCHQ and CPNI to recruit these people.
No,
There's a thing called the Cyber Challenge.
no. They are that Cyber Challenge. That's before they've. That's before
it's
they've.
open to ex-offenders as well.
They've got. It's not open to ex-offenders. The GCHQ thing. It's absolutely not. It's really not open to
We
ex-offenders.
should still talk about Russia.
Until
Well, that's very interesting to us.
No, but the fact of the matter is that we have people with great skills, some of them in prison, some of them outside of prison, and we have to try and divert them into doing good stuff. And this is something that we haven't properly engaged with up until now. But as we see more people coming through with these hacking skills, we have to start recognizing them at an early age, which is when they become involved in criminality, usually on a very sort of incremental fashion, and we have to try and catch them and use their fantastic skills for the benefit of society, as opposed to. So, if you don't have a hacking capacity and you're in law enforcement, you're in the wrong business. You have to understand what is going on. But of course, it leads to the temptation that you're talking about. 5-6 years ago, there was no talk about law enforcement agencies recruiting hackers to develop malware. Now it happens all the time. And so we're getting into an area which is, I think, very, very opaque and difficult to regulate, and bearing in mind that these techniques are developing extremely quickly. Innovation in this area is very, very fast. So it's an open question. But Ed, do you disagree?
I want to hear. We should talk about Russia.
Well, just one thing to add to answer your questions. The problem is that in Russia, the task to control the security services is delegated to the security services themselves. And we have every security service create their own, so-called self-security department. The problem is But if we are talking about corruption scandal in these security services, that's turned out by some strange coincidence that in many cases the chiefs of these self-security departments are involved. This is the problem. There is no outside control.
My name's Sandra. I just wanted to ask Andrea and Irina how they publish their material. What sort of... Misha said you were a journalist.
Yeah.
So you publish articles?
Yeah.
Yes, we published articles on our website, www.agentur.ru, and you can find a lot in English version of the website.
And what kind of angle do you take? I was wondering, I mean, do you present yourself as a couple of techies, or are you taking a social or political angle? I mean...
angles, it's everything changing. The angle is everything changing because we started to pay attention to the surveillance program in 2008. It's as I thought at that time that this issue would be more emphasized in future, but now we see that not a lot of people are interested in this topic and in this issue. Are not interested in know a lot about Russia's surveillance state, but at the same time, the surveillance technologies are developed very well, and so now we pay more attention to the companies who are in producing surveillance technologies and to the state's program to support this surveillance technology. So there is no one angle.
Right, so
They've been, Irina and Andrei have been working for many, many years doing excellent work on political analysis of the Russian security state. And I mean...
They've got a great book. I mean, the New Nobility is the definitive book on the FSB.
Yeah.
I can't help remembering how many journalists die in Russia every year for publishing stuff that the state doesn't like. I mean, that's sort of what I'm getting at, how you publish your material and how...
Well, it became quite difficult. You're absolutely right. It's not about sometimes pressure might be not so straightforward. You would be killed or sometimes it might be more sophisticated. For example, for 12 years we were forced to change 7 publications. So we tend to we actually we launched our website in 2000. And after that, we worked with some of the biggest newspapers in Russia. But something always happens with these newspapers. Sometimes editor was forced to resign. Sometimes a whole publication, like Moscow News, for example, was closed down completely. And now when we need to publish something, for example, take example of our book is a very good example. First, we were forced to write the book in English and to find the publisher in the United States, and only after that the book was published in Russia after a 1-year delay. And the FSB immediately sent a request to the printing house asking who paid for the book, and that was great. And some of the online biggest stores refused to sell the book. So it's quite a tricky thing. Sometimes, for example, now we tend to publish our stories on Wired, not because we are so fond of American publications, just because to get this stuff published in Russia, you need to get it published in English in the West.
But Wired is a very, very good place to...
It's an excellent place.
It's a very good place to look. Really, I think the best publication on these overall issues, and the fact that they're taking material from Irina and Andrei speaks very well of them. Let's take 2 or 3 questions now. 1, 2. So...
Thank you very much. The name's Ewan Grant. I'm the former intelligence analyst in the UK Customs Service for the ex-Soviet countries. And when I took a call from an Estonian law enforcement colleague last week and told him about this event, he was extremely interested, and he'll be keeping a watch out. And when I mentioned the names Misha Glenny and Edward Lucas, his interest shot up even further. I can't exaggerate the importance Glennyism and Lucasism is given in these countries, and that will apply to the new nobility as well. The question is there any indication that Russia is using these capabilities as a bargaining chip with the West, perhaps somewhat along the lines that we may see at the upcoming G8 and G20 summits on money laundering and tax evasion and all that. And all that is a very big thing. And also, are there any indications that both private company experts and the government experts, in as much as the distinction can be made, are either going over to the wholly independent bad guys, perhaps outside Russia, or indeed coming over and selling themselves to Western agencies? So it's a bit like the hackers, but on an official and transnational basis. Thank you.
At the back there, you? Yep, you.
Hello, I'm Oliver Bullough. It's all very depressing and apocalyptic, and I'm finding a bit of hope from the Russian joke that Russia makes the best microchips in the world because they're the biggest. And wondering if our salvation might be in corruption and inefficiency. Can a state as corrupt and inefficient as Russia actually do all these terrible things that you're saying it can?
Yeah, so the one thing I've always felt about Russia is despite all the corruption and inefficiency, the FSB really knows its stuff. I mean, that's, they've traditionally put a lot of resources on, but maybe in the digital world it's true. What do you think, Andre?
Well, sometimes corruption might make these efforts not to be very effective, but sometimes even the very corruption might be very productive for such countries like Russia, because, well, you might corrupt not only your own citizens, but you might corrupt as the producers of Western technologies. You might corrupt people who sell software to your country, and you might easily understand explain why it's so important, and that's a big thing. And so that's why I don't actually think that corruption might be a salvation. What we see for the last few years, that Russian state was very skillful in co-opting people from the West to serve Russian interests, and I think Lucas might know more about this problem. So that's why I'm not so optimistic.
Ed, have you got a response to that and to Ewan's question?
I mean, first of all, I think it's true that corruption is a big drag, but I still think the Russian state retains the capability to do very nasty things to people they really mind about, and so it's not much consolation that there's a lot of things they can't do if one of the things they can do is something nasty to you, whether you're a person or a country. I think the corruption point is very good. It is. I mean, it's a really big source of concern for Western law enforcement now that we see Russian state-sponsored mafia groups buying ISPs in the West. This is really dangerous. You have Russian criminal money obtained in the West through cybercrime going into the hands of these Russian mafia groups, which are often, like we saw with Russia Business Network, working hand in hand with the FSB, and then that money being recycled into investments into software companies, ISPs, or whatever in the West is extremely troubling, and I don't see sort of immediate grounds for optimism there. I think the other sort of thing about the bargaining chip, which is very interesting, is that Russia's trying very hard to change the rules by which the internet's run, and the West, sort of unbeknownst to, I think, 99% of people in the West, we suffered a really big defeat at the Dubai ITU conference.
Do you think it's a defeat, Ed?
What?
You thought it was?
Yeah, I'm worried about it. What happened? The ITU is the International Telecommunications Union, which was set up to administer the world telegram and telegraph system. And the Russians are pushing back very hard to try and get the internet away from being run basically by a bunch of engineers under the loose sponsorship of the American government, to having it run by the ITU. And they've managed to get together an array of other countries, including ones that are, when you look at them, you think they're democracies: South Africa, India, Brazil, for example. but they've managed to portray this as a kind of north-south issue, and got a lot of other poorer countries that perhaps aren't so wired up on the side as well. Of course, China is a very big player. And it was a real shock to the Western delegations, the ITU, that they were coming under such diplomatic fire. There was a fudge, as there always is, but Russia is not giving way on this. They're pushing harder. And if anyone here, if you go to the NATO Cyber Warfare Centre in Tallinn and look at their website and look at the piece that Keir Giles wrote for the cyber conference 2 years ago, last year, about the Russian thinking on information security, informaционная безопасность, and how they see the internet as the defense of their information space on the internet. I won't go into it now. It's really interesting reading. You see, all based on open source stuff, how the Russians see the future of the internet as part of their national security. And it ain't good if you come from a traditional sort of Western libertarian background.
That's absolutely right. And sometimes it's maybe even more tricky. For example, last autumn, Russian delegation and the chief of the counterterrorism unit in the United Nations, and he happened to be the former Russian ambassador to London, published a report about fighting cybercrimes, and there was a lot of stuff about retention of data, and that you need to retain all these things, etc., etc., and it was quite an unusual Russian way. The problem is that the report was funded by the British government, and I have no explanation for these kind of things, and so sometimes it might be more tricky. And again, we thought that Russia suffered a defeat at Dubai, but I'm not so optimistic, because just 2 weeks ago, 2 top cyber officials from the United States paid a visit to Moscow to talk about these issues.
Yeah.
Not the Russians came to the United States, but White House top cyber officials came to Moscow. So it's not still. Wow, it's quite depressing still.
Yeah, I don't think the ITU issue is yet decided. I think that is an ongoing struggle in terms of how the internet will be structured and how people perceive it. But I certainly think that there are real battles going on about who will control the internet and how they will control it on a state-to-state level as well as within state level. I think that's absolutely right. Any more? There were lots of hands before. There's one at the back there. And then Stephen after that.
Hi.
Can everyone introduce themselves? I'm sorry.
My name's Caroline DeBoos. I'm quite interested in the idea of like a hacking industry in Russia. I used to work for a company, and they spoke about employing Russian hackers in Russia to hack on behalf of client sites, pay them in order to test our systems to make sure that they were secure enough. And I'd like to know a bit more about that, if you know anything.
Well, it's not just Russian hackers who do that. They're called penetration testers. It's not just Russian hackers who do that. You have hackers all over the world who are employed as penetration testers. It's normal goes on in this country. You pay a good hacker to attack your systems to see where the vulnerabilities are. It's done in a commercial sense, and it's if you're a company with a lot of data and you're you're vulnerable, you have to be tested.
And also, maybe one point that we need to remember, that sometimes I'm quite confused when we are talking about Russian hackers. Do we talk about Russian hackers or Russian-spoken hackers? Because actually there is a lot of people working from Ukraine, from Kazakhstan, from the Baltic countries. They speak Russian, and I don't know how to distinguish Russian-based hackers from the hackers from the former Soviet Union.
Although some Russian hackers try and monitor whether someone is a Russian speaker working for the FBI or something like that by throwing in references to soap operas and things like that, which are going on at the moment. And if the interlocutor doesn't pick up on the soap opera reference, they target them as they designate them FBI. So if you have the point is that the hacking takes place in English on the whole. But there are large subsections of hacking in Chinese and Russian, and you have to identify. In English, it doesn't matter what your English is like. But if you're speaking Russian or if you're speaking Chinese on the internet, it does matter how good your Russian or how good your Chinese is. And so if your Russian is fluent, people have to use, in order to try and work out who they're talking to, they have to use cultural identifiers in order to establish that. That's all I meant. Stephen.
Thank you. Stephen Gray, I'm a journalist. I'd just like to ask you about you've spoken a lot about the state's role in surveillance. I'd just like to ask you about the private sector's role. In the overall globally, you might argue that the private sector is really taking the lead in surveillance technologies and primarily for commercial purposes. An example is a story in the Sunday Times last week about a mobile phone company offering to sell data on everybody's mobile phone habits, their exact location, all their friends and the way they behave, and the Metropolitan Police considering at one point buying that data. And so it's almost a byproduct, the state, the information being made available to the state, because it's private companies that are collecting all this information about everyone and analysing it for their own commercial purposes, and not just credit card scoring, but shopping habits and whatever. And I wonder what sort of industry there is in Russia in also collecting all that information and perhaps the state selling it then onwards to the state.
I think it's also the other way around, the state collecting information, the private sector selling it.
Actually, I think that the problem here, the point is that these private companies are very close to the state anyway. Most of them were established by former security services personnel back in 1989 or 1991, something like that. Just two days ago, they published a story on Wired about 5 Russian surveillance tech used in the West. And it happened that the producers of 3 of mentioned technologies are very close to the West. For example, we have a company, the largest producer of telecommunication conception, called M-Phase-Soft. The problem with this company, it's a large company. We actually sell this kind of stuff to Russia, to Uzbekistan, to Kazakhstan, and even we have the office in Canada. The problem, or maybe it's a kind of explanation, that the chief executive officer of this company was invited just in April to join the Russian delegation at the summit in Garmisch, which actually organized by top cyber official in Russia. It's organized by former advisor to the Security Council and by the actual advisor to the Security Council, who happens to be the former chief of the Science Technological Service of the FSB. And I think it's quite illuminating. These companies are always careful to maintain very close ties with the state.
Okay, we've got time for one more, I think, if there's anyone else. We may have, there we are, we'll have 2. 1, 2. So in the middle, that gentleman there, and then this lady here as number 2.
Yeah, my name's Richard. I can see how this technology is used to sort of calm down, damp down public opposition to government. I'm just interested in terrorism, because what we're seeing recently isn't sort of sinister Mr. Blofeld sat in a bubble, but what we see is 1 or 2 quirky people, America, in Britain, who outside of any system are able to cause quite a lot of trouble for a government. I mean, how does all this technology deal with people who just decide at home to do something?
Well, maybe how to combine questions? Or?
We're going to have 2 questions then.
Yeah, okay. Hello, my name is Marina. I'm a student at the University of Amsterdam. I have a question, like more a practical question actually, because I was wondering what kind of implications these developments in technology and surveillance might have for human rights defenders, especially working with foreign NGOs. Are there any means by which we could secure our communications with human rights defenders, for instance, in Russia? And do you have any tips or advices in that regard? Thank you.
Why don't we start with that one?
Maybe that
start with that one, and then we'll end up with the terror question.
Over the last 2 years, we got a number of examples when accounts of human rights activists were hacked. And as far as I understand, in most of these cases, they used phishing technology, and it was, and well, actually, the problem with NGOs, they are not so, they don't have money to introduce really and to use very sophisticated technologies. They tend to use normal email accounts, and they were hacked, and this information was used by the pro-government TV. For example, the most famous example was with the organization Golos, and the chief of his organization was hacked, and his emails were showed on TV, and it was a kind of proof that he actually worked with the West or something like that. And as far as I see, there is no now NGOs try to find a solution, but actually they are not so sophisticated. They lack money. They lack fund. They lack training. So maybe now it's a very good time to try to teach them how to use even the basic things, because again, Tor is not very popular in Russia. And a question about terrorism.
Can I give an example?
Yeah, maybe you can give an example.
It seems to be not very effective in fighting with terrorism because in 2010 it was bombings in on Moscow metro station, and after that police published photographs from CCTV that installed in underground. It was women of certain age, and they said that she might be a potential terrorist, but this woman recognized herself on the paper, and she was absolutely innocent, and this CCTV didn't help them to find any terrorist. After that, suicide bombers were recognized, but there were no help from the CCTV in looking for aid of terrorists.
And the same thing we have with Anna Politkovskaya assassination investigation. We have footage of the killer, but nobody was able to recognize, and it was used in the court, but actually all people were acquitted then. So it's not very, still it's not very effective.
I think you've got to distinguish between oppression and public order, which may be the same thing in Mr. Putin's eyes, but actually different. That the digital surveillance tools make it very easy to see who's going in and out of the Moscow office of Human Rights Watch, and then find out their internet banking details and persecute them one way or another, or put them on television and humiliate them or whatever. It doesn't work very well if you have a guy in a village in the North Caucasus who hates the Russian state because he blames it for the death of his family, and has decided he wants to go and let off some bombs somewhere, and probably has access to firearms and ammunition and so on. So I think there's the Russians will always argue we need more controls on the internet in order to fight terrorism. I think it's fundamentally it's not a strong argument. I'm very nervous about the idea of whether you call them pro-democracy or human rights defenders or whatever, going down the road of digital security, because it's so easy to get it wrong. And it makes it, first of all, it can be very conspicuous. You know, you're standing on the roof of an apartment block in Moscow with a satellite phone thinking you're frightfully clever, but actually, you know, it's a really obvious thing to do. And simply adopting all this cryptography already can make people think, that's interesting, what have they got to hide? And it also gives the lie to the main message, which is of openness. You know, if you're trying to change Russia and make it an open democratic society, why are you using some super secret technology? So I think the real advice is for people to try and be open and be as numerous as possible. And there's some quite worrying examples of people. I'm not in Russia, I think, but in the Arab world, where there was a pressure group that gave people all sorts of whizzy digital tools, which didn't work, and actually made it really easy. I think it was in Syria, I think it was, made it really easy for the regime to track them down and then arrest them, torture them and kill them. So I'm very sceptical, unless you really, really know what you're doing, which I think is going to be quite unlikely in the kind of rather amateurish human rights and pro-democracy world. I think it's better just to be open and just assume every email you send is copied to vvp@gov.ru, and then just let them make of it what they want.
To finish on a slightly positive note, of which we haven't had that many, actually in the past 2 years, and if we look at the protests, the demonstrations and so on, there has been a mobilization using the internet, and they were not able to shut that down. And particularly if you look at China, which also has extensive surveillance techniques, microblogging and messaging is changing political culture in China, particularly when it comes to issue of corruption within the party and local administrations. And so once again, I'd say the battle has commenced. The outcome is not yet certain, and it's up to all of us to engage with it, and why I think this subject is especially important. So thank you all very much for coming, but most importantly, thanks to Ed, Irina, and to Andrei for their wise comments. And